The Vietnam War was a long, painful conflict that lasted from the 1950s to 1975. It was a war fought between North and South Vietnam. The war involved not only the Vietnamese but also other countries, especially the United States. This war deeply affected Vietnam and its people. It also had a lasting impact on the world, especially in the United States. Vietnam has a long history of fighting for independence. For many years, the country was ruled by foreign powers. In the 19th century, Vietnam was part of French Indochina. The French took control of the country and exploited its resources. The Vietnamese people did not accept this. They fought back in an effort to regain their freedom. Ho Chi Minh was a key figure in Vietnam's fight for independence. He led the Viet Minh, a group that wanted freedom from the French. After World War II, Ho Chi Minh declared independence for Vietnam. This event set the stage for more conflict, as the French did not want to lose control of the region. After World War II, the French tried to hold on to their colony. They fought the Viet Minh in a war known as the First Indochina War. The Vietnamese wanted freedom, but the French wanted to keep control. The war lasted from 1946 to 1954. It ended with a decisive battle at Dien Bien Phu. In this battle, the French were defeated. This defeat led to the signing of the Geneva Accords in 1954. The Accords temporarily divided Vietnam into two parts. The North was controlled by Ho Chi Minh and his communist government. The South was controlled by an anti-communist government. The division was supposed to be temporary, with elections planned for 1956 to reunify the country. The division of Vietnam into two parts created tension. The North, led by Ho Chi Minh, was communist. The South, led by President Ngo Dinh Diem, was supported by the United States and opposed communism. The United States feared that if communism spread in Vietnam, it would spread throughout Southeast Asia. This fear led the United States to support the South Vietnamese government. However, the government in the South was weak and corrupt. President Diem did not have the support of many people in South Vietnam. The country was unstable, and the South Vietnamese government faced opposition from both communists and non-communists. The situation was growing more dangerous. In the South, a group called the Viet Cong began to form. The Viet Cong were communist fighters who wanted to overthrow the government in the South. They used guerrilla tactics, like ambushes and surprise attacks, to fight the South Vietnamese forces. They received support from the North, which wanted to reunify Vietnam under communist rule. The conflict between the North and South escalated. By the early 1960s, as the United States began sending military advisors to help the South Vietnamese army. However, the situation was getting worse, and the United States feared that the South would lose the war. In 1964, a key event happened that led the United States to escalate its involvement in the war. This event was called the Gulf of Tonkin Incident. The United States claimed that North Vietnamese ships attacked U.S. naval vessels. This led Congress to pass the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, giving President Lyndon B. Johnson the power to use military force in Vietnam. By 1965, the United States began sending large numbers of combat troops to Vietnam. The goal was to stop the spread of communism. However, the war in Vietnam was not like other wars the US had fought. The North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong were not fighting a traditional war. They used guerrilla tactics that made it hard for the US military to win. The war was much harder for the United States than they had expected. The US military was powerful, but the terrain in Vietnam was difficult. The dense jungles and harsh conditions made it hard to find the enemy. The Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese army used the landscape to their advantage. They hid in the jungle, set traps, and attacked unexpectedly. The US military used heavy airstrikes and bombing campaigns to try to destroy the enemy. One of the most well-known bombing campaigns was called Operation Rolling Thunder. The goal was to weaken the North Vietnamese by destroying their infrastructure. However, the North Vietnamese were resilient. They kept fighting, and the bombing campaigns did not bring the desired results. The United States also used chemical agents like Agent Orange to destroy the jungle. This was supposed to make it easier to spot the enemy. However, Agent Orange caused severe damage to the environment and the people of Vietnam. Many people were affected by the chemicals, and the effects lasted for generations. As the war dragged on, people in the United States began to question the government's decision to stay involved in Vietnam. The war was becoming more and more unpopular. The media played a significant role in shaping public opinion. Television brought the brutal reality of the war into American homes. People saw images of the destruction, the suffering, and the death. Students and young people led protests against the war. Many believed the war was unjust and unnecessary. The anti-war movement grew larger, and public support for the government's actions declined. People questioned the reasons for the war and whether it was worth the cost in lives. The soldiers who fought in Vietnam faced many challenges. Most of the soldiers were young and had been drafted to fight. They did not choose to go to war. Many soldiers struggled with the difficulty of fighting in a foreign land. They had little understanding of the country or the people they were fighting for. The soldiers were often exposed to constant danger. They lived in fear of ambushes, traps, and enemy attacks. The emotional toll of the war was heavy. Many soldiers returned home with physical injuries, but they also carried deep psychological scars. Post-traumatic stress disorder became a common issue for those who fought in the war. The war changed the lives of many soldiers. It took a toll on their mental and emotional health. Many soldiers returned home to a society that did not understand their experience. They faced criticism and rejection from some people who opposed the war. By the late 1960s, as the United States began to reconsider its involvement in the war, President Richard Nixon, who took office in 1969, introduced a policy called Vietnamization. This policy aimed to reduce U.S. involvement in the war. It called for the South Vietnamese to take on more responsibility for fighting the war. The idea was to train the South Vietnamese army and give them the resources they needed to fight the North. The United States would gradually withdraw its troops from Vietnam. While this strategy was in place, the fighting did not stop. The North Vietnamese continued their efforts to reunify the country. In 1973, after years of intense fighting, the United States and North Vietnam reached a peace agreement. This agreement was called the Paris Peace Accords. The accord called for a ceasefire and for U.S. troops to leave Vietnam. It also required both sides to negotiate a peaceful solution. However, the peace did not last long. The war continued between the North and the South. The United States had withdrawn, but the conflict between the North and South Vietnamese armies continued. In 1975, the war reached its tragic conclusion. The North Vietnamese launched a final offensive against the South. The South Vietnamese government was weak, and it was unable to defend itself. On 30 April 1975, the North Vietnamese captured Saigon, the capital of South Vietnam. This event marked the end of the war. The country was reunified under communist rule. The fall of Saigon was a sad moment for many people in the South. They had fought for their independence but lost. It was also a turning point for the United States. The war had cost many lives, and it had torn the country apart. After the war ended, Vietnam was left in ruins. The country had suffered tremendous damage during the conflict. The war had destroyed villages, homes, and infrastructure. Millions of people had died or been wounded. The country faced years of rebuilding and recovery. The war also left a lasting impact on the people who lived through it. Many Vietnamese were displaced, and families were separated. The effects of the war were felt for generations. The physical and emotional wounds of the war were deep. In the United States, left scars as well. Many Americans were left questioning their government's actions. The war led to a loss of trust in the government and a re-evaluation of U.S. foreign policy. The impact of the war could be felt in politics, society, and culture. had a significant impact on global politics. It was part of the Cold War struggle between communism and capitalism. The United States had hoped to stop the spread of communism in Southeast Asia. However, the war showed the limitations of military power. The war also showed the importance of understanding the culture and history of the countries involved in a conflict. It was a reminder that wars are not just about weapons and armies. They are about people and the lives that are changed forever. Left many lessons for future generations. It showed that war is not a simple solution to political problems. The human cost of war is immense. The war also showed that diplomacy, negotiation, and understanding are key to avoiding conflict. It was a tragic chapter in history, but it also taught the world valuable lessons about the importance of peace and diplomacy.